It's late April, 1865. You're standing on the deck of a paddle wheel steamboat on the Mississippi River, somewhere north of Memphis. The war is over. You survived Andersonville or Cahaba or one of the other Confederate prison camps that nearly killed you. You're finally going home. The deck beneath your feet is packed so tight with men you can barely move. Soldiers are sleeping on every surface, the stairs, the hurricane deck, even leaning against the smokestacks for warmth. The boat groans under the weight of all of them. But none of that matters, because you're alive, and tomorrow you'll see your family. Then, just after 2 in the morning, the boiler explodes, and in an instant, the greatest maritime disaster in American history begins. One that will kill more people than the Titanic. And yet, almost no one today remembers it happened. To understand how more than 2,000 men ended up crammed onto a boat designed for fewer than 400, you have to understand the spring of 1865. The Civil War was collapsing to its end. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th. The nation was simultaneously celebrating and grieving. Across the South, tens of thousands of Union soldiers were being released from Confederate prisoner of war camps. These men were in catastrophic condition. Many had survived months or years at places like Andersonville, Georgia, where nearly 13,000 Union prisoners had died of starvation, disease, and exposure. The freed prisoners were gathered at a parole camp near Vicksburg, Mississippi, waiting for transport north. They were emaciated, sick, and desperate. The U.S. government had contracted with steamboat operators on the Mississippi to carry them home. And this is where greed entered the picture. The federal government paid steamboat operators $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer transported upriver. It was lucrative work, and competition for the contracts was fierce. Captain James Cass Mason of the steamboat Sultana wanted that contract badly. Evidence strongly suggests that bribes were paid. Captain Frederick Speed, the Union officer in charge of organizing the transport, and Captain George Williams, who managed the parole camp, appear to have funneled a disproportionate number of soldiers onto the Sultana in exchange for kickbacks from Mason. A subsequent military investigation would confirm this corruption. The Sultana had a legal capacity of 376 passengers and crew. When it pulled away from the Vicksburg wharf on April 24, 1865, it carried an estimated 2,137 souls, possibly more. The exact number was never firmly established because the loading was so chaotic that accurate manifests were never completed. There was another problem. On its way south to Vicksburg, the Sultana had developed a leak in one of its 4 tubular boilers. Captain Mason knew about it. He ordered a patch repair in Vicksburg rather than a proper replacement because a full repair would have taken days. Days during which another steamboat might claim his contract. The repair was crude, a local boilermaker named R.G. Taylor later testified that he had warned Mason the fix was temporary and that the boiler needed to be replaced. Mason ignored the warning. The soldiers needed to move. The money needed to flow. The Sultana steamed north. The Sultana stopped briefly in Memphis, Tennessee, on the evening of April 26th to offload cargo, sugar and a crate of alligators of all things. Photographs taken at the Memphis wharf that day show the boat listing visibly under the weight of its human cargo. Soldiers packed every inch of available space. Some Memphis residents who saw the overloaded vessel expressed alarm. But the boat departed anyway, heading upriver into the night. The Mississippi was swollen with spring floodwaters, running fast and cold. Submerged trees and debris floated in the dark current. The men aboard slept as best they could, dreaming of home. Among them was Private Chester Berry of the 20th Ohio Infantry, who had survived Cahaba Prison in Alabama. There was Sergeant Joseph Stevens of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry and Anna Ennis, one of a handful of civilian women aboard with her husband, Lieutenant Harvey Ennis. Each of them trusted that the worst was behind them. At approximately 2 a.m. on April the 27th, 1865, 7 miles north of Memphis, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded in rapid succession. The blast tore the center of the boat apart. The twin smokestacks collapsed. Scalding steam and shrapnel ripped through the decks where hundreds of men lay sleeping. Survivors described the sound as a deafening roar, followed by screaming. Endless screaming. Men who had been sleeping on the upper decks were thrown into the air. The hurricane deck collapsed downward, crushing those below. Within minutes, fire broke out, fed by the coal stores and the wooden superstructure of the boat itself. The men faced an impossible choice: stay on the burning boat and be consumed by flames, or jump into the freezing Mississippi River, a river swollen to nearly 3 miles wide in places, churning with debris. Most of the soldiers could not swim. Many were too weak from months in prison camps to even stand. Those who jumped found the river bitterly cold. The spring floodwaters were barely above freezing. Men clung to anything that floated: splintered planks, barrel staves, dead horses, each other. Some, who grabbed onto floating debris, were pulled under by drowning men, clutching at them in desperation. Chester Berry, the Ohio private, survived by clinging to a fallen tree for hours. He later wrote a memoir describing the scene. Men calling out the names of wives and children, men praying, men slipping beneath the water without a sound. He estimated he watched dozens of men die around him before dawn. Anna Annis was thrown into the river with her husband. She survived. He did not. She would later recount being carried downstream for miles, clinging to wreckage, surrounded by the cries of dying men in total darkness. Some survivors drifted as far as 9 miles downstream before reaching solid ground. When daylight finally came, the scope of the disaster became clear. The Sultana was a smoldering wreck, burned to the waterline and sinking. Bodies floated for miles downriver. Rescue boats from Memphis pulled survivors from the water throughout the morning, many suffering from hypothermia, burns, and broken bones. Local civilians along the riverbanks joined the rescue effort. Farmers rowed out in skiffs to pull men from trees and flooded fields. The crew of the steamer Bostona II, which had passed the Sultana earlier that evening, turned back to search for survivors. Hospitals in Memphis were overwhelmed within hours. Of the estimated 2,137 or more passengers aboard the Sultana, approximately 1,168 died, though some historians place the toll closer to 1,800. The uncertainty itself is a tragedy. Many of the dead were never recovered from the river. Many were never identified. They had survived the worst the Confederacy could inflict, only to die on the journey home. Under normal circumstances, the Sultana disaster would have dominated the national press for weeks. But April 1865 was not a normal month. The newspapers were consumed with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth, and the final collapse of the Confederacy. Booth had been killed just the day before the explosion. The sinking of the Sultana was reported, but it was buried beneath the avalanche of other news. The Memphis Daily Bulletin covered it extensively. But for most of the country, it was a footnote. The men who died on the Sultana were, in a sense, erased by history even as it was happening. The U.S. military convened an investigation. Captain Frederick Speed was court-martialed for overloading the Sultana and found guilty of neglect of duty. But the conviction was overturned on a technicality. Captain George Williams, the parole camp commander, was never charged. Captain Mason, who bore the most direct responsibility, had died in the explosion. No one was ever meaningfully held accountable. The cause of the boiler explosion was debated for years. Some attributed it to the faulty repair. Others pointed to low water levels in the boilers caused by the boat's rocking motion on the swollen river. A few even alleged Confederate sabotage, though no credible evidence supported this claim. The most likely explanation, supported by modern engineering analysis, is that the patched boiler gave way under the stress of powering a massively overloaded vessel against a flooding river's current. It was a failure of metal, and a failure of every person who chose profit and expedience over the lives aboard. The survivors of the Sultana carried the disaster with them for the rest of their lives. Chester Berry published his memoir in 1892, determined that the dead would not be forgotten. He wrote that the men on the Sultana had endured the last and most cruel blow of the rebellion. Struck not by an enemy, but by the greed and negligence of their own countrymen. Sultana survivors formed associations and held reunions for decades. They erected a monument at Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee, where many of the dead were eventually memorialized, but public memory faded. By the 20th century, the Sultana had become one of the most overlooked tragedies in American history. The sinking of the Sultana remains the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. Worse than the Titanic, worse than the General Slocum, worse than the Eastland. And yet, most Americans have never heard of it. It is missing from most school textbooks. It has no major Hollywood film. It exists in a strange shadow of collective amnesia. The reason is timing. The Sultana's victims had the misfortune of dying during the most crowded month in American history, a month that held a president's murder, a war's end, and a nation's rebirth. Their deaths were swallowed whole by the noise of everything else happening around them. But the Sultana still matters. It is a story about what happens when exhausted, vulnerable people are treated as cargo, when corners are cut because the money is too good and the oversight is too weak, when a disaster is ignored because the world is looking somewhere else. These are not lessons confined to 1865. Somewhere beneath the mud and silt of the Mississippi River, near Marion, Arkansas, lie the remains of the Sultana. The river shifted its course long ago and buried the wreck under a soybean field. The men it carried, men who survived Andersonville, who survived Cahaba, who survived the entire Civil War, deserve to be remembered. This is their story. And now, you know it.